Right, I would suggest that we start. So if we can start the recording, that would be excellent. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar, which is sponsored by the European Open Science Cloud, the EOSC Nordic Baltic project, to be precise. My name is Bert Meerman. I'm from the GoFair Foundation in Holland. And it's my pleasure to actually host this session for the next 2 hours or so. As you may know, we have defined a Nordic project whereby we started to evaluate the fairness of metadata and data published by different repositories in the Nordic and the Baltic countries. Let me start by showing you a slide on FAIR and the FAIR principles. The term FAIR is actually defined here as findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and relates to these 15 FAIR principles on the screen that data and metadata should adhere to. And not only for the human eye, but mainly for machines. Let me repeat that, not only for the human eye, but mainly for machines. It's a very important statement. The machine actually should be able to find, access, interpret, and reuse the data and metadata of a repository. It's about machine actionable data and metadata. So let's keep that in mind. I'm not going into detail about these principles, but if some of you are not familiar with these FAIR principles, then please take the time to study this in more detail at a later stage. It's an excellent model to increase the interoperability in, for instance, research data, energy data, asset management data, COVID patient data, all kinds of different domains. Allow me also to emphasize that FAIR is not the same as open and free. We get very often questions about this. A data set can be offered in the market under predefined conditions at a fee or at a subscription fee and be completely fair. So making data fair does not necessarily mean that you have to give the data all away for free. Right. Back to the evaluation process. We organized earlier this year in April a so-called hackathon, and we evaluated a number of repositories on the basis of their machine findability on the internet. For the evaluation, we used a software program that could quantify the adherence to the FAIR principles and could automatically perform these evaluations. This software, FAIR Maturity Evaluator. Now, how does that work? The FAIR Maturity Evaluator, as you can see here, takes as input a global unique identifier, so-called GUID, from the repository, and explores the machine actionable metadata provided within the landing page or whatever the GUID directs to. Basic requirements, therefore, for a successful FAIR machine actionable evaluation is that the data repository provides GUID or global, uniquely identifiable, persistent, resolvable identifier for these data sets. Repositories that do not provide GUIDs for individual data sets could simply not be evaluated. So the minimum requirement, therefore, is a GUI pointing to the landing page containing links to the metadata and to the data itself. If the software finds a GUID, it can then evaluate against the FAIR principles, calculate the so-called FAIR score for each of the letters F, A, I, and R. If you fail on a particular principle, we can provide recommendations how to improve the fairness. This is how it works. And the exercise done in April was actually a big success on this basis. There were about 100 participants who showed up, and we were able to provide a number of recommendations also to repositories who wanted to improve their fairness score. However, we also noted that about 24, 25 repositories on our radar did not use a global unique ID that was pointing to the data or to the metadata, and could therefore not be automatically found, not accessed, and not evaluated by the FAIR maturity evaluator. It is exactly that what we want to discuss today in this webinar. I hope it's clear that what we are trying to achieve. Let's take a look at the agenda. We have this morning a number of distinguished speakers. First, we have Andreas Janssen, who will give an overview on the Nordic Baltic project itself. We have Helena Kuzijn. She will explain the importance and the relevance of a PID. We have Ornulfur Torlacius from Iceland explaining the implementation of a PID. And finally, we have Mike Nason from Canada with an astoundingly brief primer on PIDs, as he calls it. In terms of logistics, feel free to ask questions during or after each presentation, either by raising your hand or via the chat. And also be reminded that this session is recorded and that slides will be saved if you want to reference them at a later stage. So, thank you very much for being here, for being with us this morning. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Andreas Janssen for his presentation.
Thank you, Bert. Yes, so I will give a presentation of the EOSC Nordic project, but primarily about the work that has been done in work package 4, which is about FAIR data. So let me just start that. Hopefully you see that okay now. Okay. So the project started in September 2019, and it's one of the EOSC 5B projects, regional implementation projects of the EOSC. So in our work package 4 team, we have about 20 participants scattered all over the Nordic region, and including Bert from the Go FAIR Foundation. So what is it that the EOSC wants to achieve? It wants to achieve to basically provide to gluing the services, data sets, software, publications, and other research output for researchers in a consistent and orderly manner. So the way to do that for data is to go FAIR. So there are a number of intricacies of what FAIR actually involves, and this is also depends on the use case or the community and what their needs are. So this will vary from one community to another, or one repository to another. But the overall objective is to make research data more reusable, and ultimately to make science more transparent, efficient, and trustworthy. So the now looking at the EOSC Nordic project. So I will not spend much time explaining what the different work packages are focusing on, just a brief summary. So we have a project management work package 2, which is looking at policies and legal issues and also sustainability. Work package 3 that is looking to support services that are potential candidates for becoming part of the EOSC service or to become EOSC service providers. Then work package 4, which focuses on fair data. And then a larger work package 5, which looks at use cases and specific demonstrator cases for open research. And then finally, work package 6, which deals with outreach, communication, and engagement with the community. So these work packages are deal with different stakeholders, and between the work packages we also have quite a close collaboration. The project spans over 3 years, so we're now into year 2, and so from now on I will focus on the work done in work package 4. So this work package is divided into 3 main tasks. 1, looking at fair uptake. 2, implementation of certification and data standards. And 3, policies and incentives for FAIR. So we have a number of subtasks which are planned for these various main tasks, and they have also different connections to various stakeholders. So the first year activities has been focused on surveying in order to get an overview of the FAIR uptake in the region. The work has been focused on looking at try to measure directly the uptake of FAIR. So we have collected a sample of about approximately 100 data repositories in the Nordic region. So the selection criteria were that the data should cover the Nordic region in some aspect, and that it is not exclusively a repository for publications. So focusing on the data here. Now the evaluation tool that I will come back to, this requires the data sets to be equipped with an identifier, and this is the topic of today's webinar. Global unique identifiers, or even persistent identifiers. So this was a requirement in order to evaluate data sets in this way that I will explain in the next few slides. So then we manually selected about 10 data sets per repository, and then ran this evaluator, which uses then exclusively machine actionable metadata. So this aspect of machine actionability is a very important principle or pillar of the FAIR principles. So the data should be understandable by machines and humans. So the tool we started off with is the one provided by Mark Wilkinson, and his generation 2 metrics. So these are published in the reference in the lower right corner, Wilkinson et al. 2019. So there are 22 indicators that this tool then checks for any given identifier that we provide. So the idea is to not focus on, in our case, not focus on the evaluation of the fairness of the human readable information, but rather the machine readable information or metadata. So in the end, we ran these evaluations for more than 1,000 data sets and streamlined this using Google scripts so that we could execute the full sample evaluations of the full sample within a 24-hour period. So this is the one example of an output from this in JSON, and showing some of the elements that were discovered, the machine actionable metadata that were discovered. So doing this for more than 1,000 repositories, we averaged over each of those approximately 10, or in some cases 20 data sets per repository, and we get a table with the F, A, I, and R scores, and in the middle a score for the total FAIR score. So I should say that this slide shows the results not from the Mark Wilkinson tool, but rather a more recent tool which has come out of the FAIR project called Fuji, which essentially test more or less the same, based on the same metrics, or very similar metrics, but is more verbose in the output when running the tool. So the user gets more information about what is found. But the essential part here is, again, the point about these global unique identifiers, which is the topic of today's webinar. So we have about 25% of these 100 repositories that do not have global unique identifiers. So there's no way to uniquely identify a single data set for about 24 repositories. And so those repositories could not be evaluated with using this tool, simply from the fact that the data sets are not exposed in a way that it is possible to identify it either with their URL or with a persistent identifier. So the remaining 74 repositories, they were evaluated, and these are the result, the FAIR scores for those. So not surprisingly, the majority of the repositories are not very fair when it comes to machine actionable metadata. In fact, about 30% have no support for machine actionable metadata at all. This is the leftmost blue column. While there are a few repositories that do support some degree of these machine actionable metadata, and or have implemented support for certain metadata standards, or specifically generic metadata standards. But there were just a very small handful of repositories that actually scored more than 50% of those tests that are being executed. And I should add also that these evaluator tools that are available today, they do have their limitations, and they're also early on in their development. So clearly there are limitations to what they can test, but what they do investigate, the results are fairly objective. So these are the same results, but split into the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability metrics separately. So the highlights of this study was that the majority of repositories are not very fair, and primarily because they do not support machine actionable metadata. So this was already expected before the survey started up, but part of the objective is to not only to measure the fair uptake early on in the project, but also to monitor that over the entire project period, so until 2022. The other highlight here is that, as I mentioned, 25% of the sample could not be evaluated due to the lack of globally unique identifiers. And that is why we have chosen to, in this first FAIRification event, to focus on the importance and of identifiers and how this can be done. And we will hear from some repositories who have recently implemented DOIs, for instance. 30% of the sample, as I mentioned, score less than 10%, which means that they basically don't support any machine actionable metadata, at least that are being tested in this evaluator. The average score for those that were evaluated, for those 74 repositories, the average score is 17%. So if we then select a subsample of those that we evaluated and look at for those that we have information about what platforms they are running, so Dataverse or Figshare or other similar platforms, we find that those that are running on established or well-known platforms, the average score boosts up from 17% to 30%. So there seems to be some assistance from just from the fact of running it on a platform, or from the fact that they may have made a decision to support fair machine actionability through the use of these platforms to begin with. If we look at those repositories that were certified from these 74, we also see that the average is somewhat higher, about 24%. So certified repositories seem to have a slightly higher score on average. So what we are what we are now continuing to do is, apart from continuing to regularly evaluate these repositories, to monitor them over the next 18 months, we are also running these events, first one of which is the current one, in the hope to assist user communities or repositories to make improvements to their services. So that eventually hopefully these scores can be improved during the project period or at a later stage. Another focus area, which I mentioned very briefly, relating to the implementation task, is the certification support. So we are supporting repositories that are mature enough or willing to invest time in certifying their services according to Core Trust Seal. So this doesn't necessarily need to be a full certification, but it can be a self-assessment, which gives some indication of what work needs to be done in order to obtain such a certification. And we will have also some tasks related to implementing FAIR data standards. And early next year, we will start up the final task, major task, which is looking at fair incentives relating to policies. Yeah, I think I mentioned this thing about certification. So I think I'll stop there with some of these preliminary recommendations.
Okay, so if I could just ask if anyone has any questions for Andreas before we move on to the next speaker, which is Helena Cuisin. So do you have any questions? You might ask them via the chat or with your audio directly, or whichever you prefer. I guess no questions at this point, and we also, I guess, have some time towards the end of the webinar to ask some questions in case you come to think of anything that you want to get some clarifications on. So I guess we can move on to the next speaker, which is, as I said, Helena Cuisin, Community Engagement Director at DataCite. So please go ahead, Helena.
Morning, and thank you for the invitation. Let me share my screen first. There we go. Let me put it in full screen mode. It always seems a little slow. Ah, there we go. So yeah, as I said, thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to be part of this morning, and it was very interesting to hear a bit more about the project. I was aware that it was happening, but I didn't actually know that much about what was happening, so it's always good to get an update from other projects about what they're working on. So I was asked to speak about the importance of persistent identifiers. So yeah, to really start from the beginning, what is a persistent identifier? Well, the identifier part really is about this being a globally unique string. So only that entity is identified through that unique string. And then already the previous speakers made a distinction between unique identifiers and persistent identifiers. And I guess the persistent part is really about there being an organization behind it that made a promise to keep it alive so that it persistently resolves over time. And this then solves a long-standing problem of things no longer being available or people not being able to find it over time. Now, persistent identifiers do a number of things. For example, persistent identifiers help with disambiguation, and I think ORCID is a good example where if you look for a researcher, there are sometimes multiple people with the same name, so you're not sure who you're looking at, but also the other way around. Sometimes there are multiple versions of someone's name, and having an identifier for that person then helps with disambiguation. Persistent identifiers also link, and I think this is probably a very sort of well-known example, and that's a reference list of an article. When a researcher writes an article, there's always a reference list with the work that the article is based on, and the reference list contains persistent identifiers, and through those, the article is linked to these other articles and research outputs. But yeah, of course, nowadays, one of the easiest things to say about persistent identifiers is that they play a role in making data fair, which is also really what we're talking about in this workshop. And I won't talk about the FAIR principles because some of the previous speakers did that, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But what I want to do in the rest of my talk today is use DataCite and the DOIs that DataCite assigns as an example of how persistent identifiers can help with fairness. So yeah, let me move on to that part. And as Bert said, if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand. I'm also happy to answer questions during my presentation. So I work for DataCite. And DataCite is a global nonprofit membership organization. And so organizations around the world can join DataCite as members, and we work with over 2,000 repositories to provide DOIs for data and other research outputs in those repositories. As the name DataCite implies, we were founded because of the need to have persistent identifiers for datasets and not just for articles. But over time, we've also expanded to other kinds of research outputs. So our vision is to connect research to identify knowledge, and those connections are made through persistent identifiers. So we try to provide value in a number of ways. And the first way is very closely related to the first part of FAIRDF, and that is that registering a DOI makes your research outputs discoverable. And that's actually also when we ask members, what's the main reason you wanted to use DOIs? That's the thing they tell us most often, that they wanted to make their data sets more discoverable. Using our services also makes it easy to do these things because you can just log in, you can register your persistent identifier in less than a minute and start working towards fairness. And having a persistent identifier also helps with tracking and reporting. It makes it easier to know where your outputs are and whether others are reusing them. So, as I said, we're a member organization. We currently work with 238 members. This includes direct members, individual organizations that work with us, but also consortia, which means that we work with over 600 organizations also through those consortia. It's probably relevant for this audience to mention that there are DataCite consortia in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in Finland, in Estonia. So it's very likely that there is a consortium that you can work with if you're interested, and that can help you get started with the use of DOIs. And so we have members right now in 43 countries, and they've registered over 20 million DOIs at this point. And so assigning a DOI or persistent identifier is really the first step. So I very briefly wanted to say something about that process. So I already mentioned DOIs are suitable for a range of research outputs. We started from data sets, but organizations also assign DOIs to collections, workflows, software, but also to different kinds of gray literature, such as theses, dissertations, reports, newsletters, preprints. So you really can use persistent identifiers for many kinds of research outputs. And then we provide 3 different ways of actually registering DOIs. We have a number of APIs that you can use. Our primary API is a REST API, so it's possible to build an integration with that to automate DOI registration. Then we also have a manual interface that's especially used by smaller organizations so that they can just log in manually and click a button to create a DOI. And then we also work with what we call service providers, so platforms that have integrated with our APIs to provide DOI registration functionality to other organizations. And so, for example, the DSpace does that, also Dataverse, Figshare, so there are a number of platforms that provide that functionality. And so here you see what our interface looks like. It's called DOI Fabrica. And so here you can create, manage, and find DOIs. There's information about your DOIs. We check links to ensure that DOIs continue to resolve over time, because that's, of course, an important part of having a persistent identifier, that it does resolve over time. And this is also where organization information is maintained. So, as I said, I really kind of wanted to use DataCite as an example of how PIDs can contribute to fairness. So I briefly wanted to go through some of these aspects, starting with findability. I think this workshop also focuses on how having persistent identifiers helps you with the F in FAIR. And so we also really see that as a very important component. Something I haven't talked about that much, which I think is very important, also very clear in the FAIR principles, is that a PID is one thing, but the really important part is the accompanying metadata. And so when an organization registers a DOI, they also have to register a set of metadata for that research output. And all metadata that are submitted that way are available under a ZZ0 license, so that these can be harvested by all organizations. And that also means that outputs with DOIs are made available through different platforms. For example, our own platform, but also OpenAir, Google Dataset Search, Clarifate's Data Citation Index. So they all harvest the metadata to increase discoverability. This is an example of our own search interface, DataCite Commons. This is an example of a data set that was published by the Swedish National Data Service. And so all outputs with DOIs can be found through that platform. And this is an example of Google Dataset Search. They harvest our pages to add to their collection of data sets in their system. And so this is an example of a data set that's available that way. Now, the findable aspect is very important, but I did also want to talk a little bit about the other parts of FAIR. And I think that connecting PIDs plays a role in accessibility and interoperability. And maybe before I go through my slides, I think probably quite a simple example is if we think back to that paper with a reference list. If an author writes a paper that's based on a data set and they put that data set in the reference list with a DOI, that means the data set also becomes accessible through that paper because a reader can click on that link, it resolves to the landing page of that data set, and they can access the data that way. Now, I already talked about our metadata schema and how when organizations register DOI, they register accompanying metadata. So DataCite has a metadata schema that's constantly evolving. We have a metadata working group that meets very often. And so we keep releasing updates based on what's happening in the community. And so we have a set of mandatory properties, recommended properties, and optional properties. And one that I think is quite important is the related identifier property, because that helps us connect different entities in the research ecosystem. And so if we go back to that paper, you deposit a data set, but you also published a paper that's based on that data set. Then when you deposit the metadata, you can indicate in the metadata that this is the DOI of the article that's based on the data set, and this is the relationship between the data set and the article. For example, the article cites the data set, so then the data set is cited by the article. So there are different relation types you can use here. Now, another thing I wanted to mention is that something you can indicate in the metadata is the ROR, the Research Organization Registry ID, which is a persistent identifier for organizations. So what you're looking at here is our interface, DOI Fabrica. So here you can enter an affiliation. It looks up the ROR ID, and that way data sets become associated with your organization. And within the context of another European EOSC project, Project FREYA, which really focused on persistent identifiers, we've been working on combining all that information, on connecting all these persistent identifiers to start creating a graph. So we call that the PID graph. And so, as you can see on my screen, we know the relationship between A and B from the metadata, and we know the relationship between B and C from the metadata. And because we're now connecting all that information, we also know the relationship between A and C. And as you can see on the right, this way we've started connecting datasets to publications, but also to the researchers that generated them, and to the organizations that they're associated with, and to the funders that funded the research. And we're now making that information available through DataCite Commons. So there's an interface where you can now access that information. So then obviously I'm now coming to the R, I'm getting closer to the end of my presentation, and that is data reuse. Because I think in a way data reuse is quite an important goal. When data is shared, it is really so it can be reused. And so something we want to do is using persistent identifiers to start assessing reuse of data sets. So in the context of the Make Data Count project, we've been working on defining a standard way of counting views and downloads. And in the context of the RDA WDS Scholix working group, we've been working on standardizing how we count citations. And so we're now increasingly doing that and making that information available. So this is a Dryad data set, which was cited 42 times, which is quite a lot for a data set. And then also, this is at an organizational level, in this case, the European Commission. We also aggregate citations and views and downloads. And for repositories, we make a small widget available that they can implement on their own pages to start showing those data metrics. So here you see an implementation by the EDI data portal. So at the bottom of my screen, you can see a small widget that shows the number of citations for that data set. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present here today. There's a number of ways in which you can reach us. If you have additional questions or want additional information, you can always email us or talk to us on the PID forum. And I'm also very happy to take questions today, right now, or at the end of this session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elena. Do we have any immediate questions for her? If not, I suggest we take a short break. Bert, did we decide on having a 5-minute break for stretching?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. We definitely have some time. I think we're right on schedule, so that is excellent. Let's take a small break. It's now 10:47, what I see. So what shall we do? Shall we be back, let's say, around 11 o'clock? Is that a good idea? And then everybody can take a coffee, and we will resume this meeting then at exactly 11 o'clock.